Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest today is Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and journalist Kai Bird. He won that Pulitzer for his 2005 biography, American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of Robert J. Oppenheimer. Kai co-authored the book, which the current hit film is based on, with the late Marty Sherwin. Both Kai and Marty are former Wilson Center History and Public Policy Program Public Policy Fellows. And Kai, welcome. Really excited to talk to you about this. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, John.
So I know you've seen the movie several times. So why don't we put on our film critic hats to begin? And what do you think?
Well, actually, I've seen it 5 times. And, it's well worth revisiting each time. It's a very complicated movie. I think it's a great artistic achievement cinematically. And, Hollywood miracle, it's also really quite historically accurate and a faithful rendering of the biography that Marty and I wrote all these many years ago.
So Christopher Nolan, a great filmmaker and a pretty good historian.
I would, yes, absolutely.
So does it capture the Robert J. Oppenheimer that you came to know, you and Marty came to know when you worked on the book?
Yes, in many ways. The complexity, the fragile nature of his personality, particularly when he was a young man, his brittleness, his intensity. But of course, what Nolan has done, as any good film director and screenwriter, he's transformed the story and put it in this other wonderful medium. And it's his film. It is, as I said, largely based on American Prometheus. I recognize, whole lines, paragraphs taken right out of the book from dialogue. But I think Cillian Murphy's portrayal of Oppenheimer is particularly touching, and I'm sure if Oppie was here with us today, he'd be horrified at the portrayal on screen. But so would we all if we were portrayed on screen. Yeah. It's a different medium. But I think he captured the personality and the intensity of the man and his times.
Film buffs love to dissect a movie and talk about where it's completely accurate, where there's artistic license taken. When you watch the film, you had 700 plus pages to work with. Chris Nolan had 3 hours roughly to work with, and that's even very long for a Hollywood movie. Are there any notable areas where there is either time compression or maybe a changing of sequencing of occurrences that are worth noting?
Well, the film does concentrate on Oppenheimer as an adult. You don't see him portrayed in his childhood. And I can see why he did that. It's a long, complicated movie, and he can't do everything. But I was glad that he portrayed Oppenheimer in the beginning there, in this scene where he's undergoing clearly some kind of emotional crisis. This is the so-called poison apple incident, which is a little controversial, and we're not quite sure in the book. If you read the poison apple incident, we go on for pages to sort of dissect the evidence of what happened, and it still remains a mystery. In the film, it's a very vivid, fleeting episode, but I think it is a legitimate for what it was attempting to achieve, which was to portray Oppenheimer as a human being, as a young man who was going through an emotional crisis and intellectual failure for the first time in his life that threw him into a psychological crisis. And that humanizes this historical icon.
What about the encounters with Albert Einstein? Does the historical record support that?
Well, that dialogue, is obviously, even in the film, it's portrayed as a private conversation between Einstein and Oppenheimer. And so, yes, it's an imagined conversation, but it's not an improbable conversation. The two men knew each other. They were friends. They were rivals in their approaches to quantum physics. Oppenheimer was ostensibly Albert's boss down the hall, and but they did admire each other, and they did have a warm relationship, and they could have talked to each other, just as the film portrays.
Beyond the film, focusing more on the book in this case, take us back to what kind of pressure was Oppenheimer and the entire United States military and government feeling in terms of the head start that the Nazis had in development of this weapon?
Yeah, in 1942, Oppenheimer, when he was recruited to this project, highly classified, he, as a young man, had studied in Germany with these German physicists. He had met Werner Heisenberg, as portrayed in the film, and he knew that they were just as capable as he was of understanding the implications of the discovery of fission, and that there could easily be created a Big Bang, a terrible weapon. And it was, there was no physics that needed to be invented in World War II. It was all done before the war. And it was merely a big engineering problem. And yes, the Americans believed, based on all the intelligence they had, that the Germans had a bomb project and that they were, maybe 18 months ahead. And so this was Oppenheimer's motivation, his sole motivation for, well, I wouldn't say sole motivation. He was a very ambitious young man, and he wanted to contribute to the war effort. And he was certainly motivated in terms of his own personal politics to fear that the Nazis could win the war with this terrible weapon, and he wanted to prevent the victory of fascism. So, yes.
At what point does he realize the significance of what he and the team are creating?
Oh, I think he understood it from the very beginning.
From the get-go.
And this is what's also complicated about Oppenheimer's intelligence, and he's capable of holding contradictions in his head. He's doing his duty. He's doing he's in this race against the Nazis, and at the same time, he's fully aware that it's a weapon unlike any other weapon, and a terrible thing, and that if it's ever used, it's going to be used on innocents, because there is no military target large enough to test such a weapon in combat, and that will be a tragedy. So he was painfully aware of the moral and ethical issues involved.
The importance of the individual in history, the old conundrum, does history make the man or man make history? How unique was Robert J. Oppenheimer? And in your estimation, is this something that if he hadn't been the choice, someone else could have achieved the same thing on the same timeline? Or are there things about him as an individual that make him completely unique?
Well, this is what historians call a counterfactual. We'll
Yes.
never know.
Yes.
But, Marty and I we report in the narrative that, everyone that Marty interviewed, and Marty Sherwin did most of the interviews and most of the research, indeed, in the archives for this book. In all the interviews that he did of veterans of Los Alamos, they all, agreed that if any other scientist had been selected to become the scientific director at Los Alamos, they probably would not have produced the gadget in 2.5 years. That there was something special about his charisma and his leadership and his ability to bring people together and synthesize problems, and that he was special in this way. And he certainly was improbably charismatic and a great administrator. You know, he'd never administered anything more than a dozen graduate students at Berkeley. And then he's selected for this very complicated project and bringing together hundreds of scientists with large egos. But he was good at it. And I think we explain in the book that he was good at it precisely because he just wasn't only a quantum physicist. He was a polymath. He, loved English literature and the novels of Ernest Hemingway, and he could speak in plain English and convey to people his understanding of the problem at hand. And he was able to motivate people to work hard at Los Alamos and to play hard at Los Alamos. The example being the very stiff gin martinis he would serve people on the weekends.
So the book comes out in 2005. You win the Pulitzer in 2006. And here we are, 2023. The film hits the silver screen. Well, why did it take so long?
Oh, it didn't take very long. Biography is, I would argue, the most rigorous form of scholarship. It's the research is endless because you're doing one human being, and of course, it's impossible to know and understand one human being, and yet there's a specificity that's involved, and you're always curious to know, well, what was my character doing on this day or that day? And there's always one more archive to visit and one more interview to be done. So Marty, spent 20 years researching this project from 1980 until 2000 when he recruited me. I was in between books and I'd done 2 big biographies, and I couldn't figure out what to do next. And he encouraged me to join him on his journey. And he was a very funny, wry guy. And at one point, Marty said, "If you don't join me, my tombstone is going to read, 'He took it with him.'"
Were you instantly interested?
Oh yeah, I had, in my biography of John McCloy and my next book on Mac Bundy and his brother Bill, I had to write about Oppenheimer because all of these people were friends of Oppenheimer's. So I'd studied Oppenheimer. I was interested in the history of the atomic bomb and Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so I knew it was an important subject. I knew it was Marty's subject, but he convinced me that it was time for me to join him. And we had a terrific collaboration. It was just an amazing partnership. And it still took us 5 years.
And then how does Chris Nolan finally decide that this is worthy of his attention to make a blockbuster film?
Yeah, well, that's a miracle too. The book came out 18 years ago, and suddenly we've got a movie. And even before we won the Pulitzer, the book was optioned for film, not once, but in a series of times. Every 2 to 4 years, would be re-optioned. And initially, Marty and I were excited, oh, Hollywood is calling. But as the years rolled by, we became more and more skeptical of Hollywood's big talk. And, by 2021, we had virtually given up. And then suddenly I got a phone call saying that Christopher Nolan wants to talk to me. And what had happened was an accident. The people who had the film option, a MIT trained physicist named Dave Wargo, in the middle of the pandemic, flew out in a private jet to Hollywood and managed to hand the book to one of Nolan's producers. And Nolan read the book in early 21, fell in love with it, by all accounts. And then, without contacting us, he sat down over the early spring and summer of 21 and wrote a script just to see if he could do it on spec as such. He wrote a very long script, and in September of 21, he called and said that he had picked up the film option, he was satisfied with his screenplay, and that he was going to make this. So I had a meeting with Nolan in New York where he told me all of this in person. He's a very charming, smart guy. Unfortunately, Marty was unable to come with me to New York for that meeting. He was very ill, struggling with small cell lung cancer. And 2 weeks after my meeting with Nolan, Marty died. But he passed knowing that this was going to happen, and I'm glad for that. But I truly regret that he's not here to see the result.
Yeah, it really is sad that he couldn't be here at this moment. That was the terrific memorial that we had for him at the Reagan Building that you participated in as well. And now there's a Marty Sherwin Fellowship at the Wilson Center. Back to this moment and the book and the movie now coming together in this amazing way. Before I sat down with you today, I decided to drive about a half a mile to my local Barnes and Noble just to take a look. And there, a giant display of this book right in front of the cash register. It must be very rewarding for you to see your book essentially have a re-release on the heels of this film.
Yes. Oh, it's fabulous. It's, every struggling biographer, struggles alone in isolation to produce these works and hopes eventually that they'll find an audience. But it's very hard to sell books. And this is, a 720-page biography. It's not a hard book to read, but it is long and complicated, and so I'm just gratified that Nolan came along and was inspired to do what he did based on the book, and it's now on the bestseller list for the last 10, 11 weeks. And that just means that people, both in America, but also all over the world, there are many different foreign language editions, Chinese, Russian, and Portuguese and Spanish. And so this is an important story for people everywhere to understand. The dawn of the atomic age, the danger of these nuclear weapons, which we're still living with. Just see what's happened in the war in Ukraine, where the threat of tactical nuclear weapons being used is a very real danger. But it's also a story that is so relevant to our lives in terms of understanding American politics today. To understand the Trump era, you just have to understand that the Trump politics was, the seeds of all that were planted during the McCarthy era, where Robert Oppenheimer became the chief celebrity victim of the McCarthy witch hunts. And Donald Trump was taught his brand of politics by one Roy Cohn, who was Senator Joseph McCarthy's chief counsel, and who actually tried to go after Oppenheimer in 1954 and had to be called off by Vice President Richard Nixon, who was sent down to tell Joe McCarthy and Roy Cohn, we have other plans for Oppenheimer, i.e. this terrible security hearing that they were going to force him to go through it.
So is Oppenheimer now getting the amount of attention that he deserves in terms of the annals of historical figures and their importance? Has he been somewhat under the radar before this moment in history?
Well, yes, I think so. One of my fears when the book was released, and of course when the film was released, I understood that most people, particularly the newer generation, had no idea who Robert Oppenheimer was. And I think most, the millions of people who've gone to see the film probably knew nothing more than the fact that he was father of the atomic bomb. And of course, he was much more than that. And his story is just a fascinating, compelling story in and of itself. But as I said, it's so relevant in terms of the politics and the atomic age that we're trying to survive.
Yeah, it's really a cultural phenomenon too, in that I'm an avid film goer. I'd probably see 1 to 2 films a week. But people that I know haven't seen a film on the big screen in years are going to see Oppenheimer. Often they're going to see it in 70 millimeter IMAX. It really has taken on a life of its own.
Yeah, it's become a real cultural phenomenon. And I'm very, very glad for that. And I think, historians are going to argue about the history portrayed in the film, as historians argue about books in any case. But it's, it's a terrific story, and a lot of it is actually straight out of the book and grounded in the work of many, many footnotes.
Pages. I can go through them right now. So, what did you think of the ending of the film? I mean, very somber. The audience leaves in almost a bit of a daze. That's one of the toughest things, I think, to nail the landing, whether it's a drama, a comedy, whatever. That final scene is often tough. A terrific movie often has an unsatisfying ending. What did you think of Nolan's decision on how to end this film?
Yeah, you're right. I was emotionally struck and, teary-eyed myself, seeing it the first time and even the second and third time. It's a very tough ending in that it reminds you vividly of the potential for Armageddon, that these weapons are still out there, as Oppenheimer in this imagined conversation turns to Albert Einstein and says, well, we may just have invented something that will plant the seeds of our own destruction, something of that. I'm paraphrasing, but and it's true. We're still living with these dangerous weapons. And Oppenheimer himself, just 3 months after Hiroshima, he gives a public speech in Philadelphia where he, amazingly enough, as the most famous American scientist at the time, he nevertheless says in that very magnetic voice of his, you may think that these weapons are cheap, are expensive. You may think these weapons are expensive because we spent $2 billion. Actually, they are very cheap, and they are weapons for aggressors, and they are weapons of terror. And he was arguing that they're not a defensive weapon, they're not a military weapon, they're a weapon of terrorism, and that would be the only purpose in using one of these things. And yet, knowing the human mammal, there can be no certainty that they won't be used again.
No, we all hold our breath.
Or by a crazy political leader, and he also warned very clearly that these weapons can be built by any small country, however poor, however impoverished. There's no secret to them. And so, he was predicting our dilemma today, living with a North Korea armed with atomic weapons, and Pakistan and India and Israel, and maybe tomorrow Iran. Yeah. So his story is really sobering, and it's shocking at the end. And I'm glad that I think what Nolan did with the ending is brilliant. And I also would defend his decision not to portray actually what happened on the ground in Hiroshima with old newsreel footage or such. I know too that was sort of a controversial, has drawn some controversy. Why didn't he depict the victims, the Japanese victims of the 2 bombs? But I think his choice was brilliant there too, in that he forced the viewers of the film to see through Oppenheimer's eyes how he was imagining the victims on the ground, and forcing the viewer of the films to imagine for themselves what had happened makes it more vivid and personal in a way. And if he had done anything else, I think it would have been seen, it would have trivialized the immense destruction that did happen on the ground at Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Often the horrors in a film are more effective when you don't see them, right? It's you know what happened, and your mind can take you to places that the filmmaker might not have ever been able to. I want to ask you, Kai, stepping back from the story of Robert Oppenheimer, and just about your interest in biography as the primary format of your work as a historian.
Yes, well, today I actually, I'm the executive director of something called the Leon Levy Center for Biography here in New York City. It's housed at City University's Graduate Center. And it's a unique institution. There's nothing like it in the country or in the world, really, where we exist to sort of promote the art and craft of biography, this very difficult scholarship. And we give out 5 awards to working biographers, either first-time biographers or veteran biographers, and they get a $72,000 fellowship. And then we put them on stage to talk about their new books. And it's a really, biography is very special to my heart. I think it's the best form of history. It's compelling. It's the kind of history that is often a page turner, precisely because it's focused on one life. And along the way, readers learn an awful lot of history and sociology and culture. And so it's just a wonderful vehicle for storytelling. And of course, we human beings need to have storytellers to explain to us our lives and where we are in this complicated world.
And you mentioned Roy Cohn, the infamous and famous Roy Cohn earlier, and according to your website, that's your latest project. You're working on a biography of him.
Yes, for all my sins, last October, I signed a contract to do a biography of Roy Cohn. And I did so because I sort of after, my last biography was on Jimmy Carter, a very decent human being.
The Outlier, is that right?
The Outlier.
Yes.
And I spent 6 years, working on Jimmy Carter, a very decent person. And I decided I needed a change of pace. But also, I decided that, actually, Roy Cohn makes an appearance in my Carter book. He makes an appearance in the Oppenheimer book, in Bundy, in The Color of Truth, and in The Chairman, the biography on John McCloy. And he's always in a paragraph or two, he makes an appearance in which he's this sort of annoying scoundrel who is the bad boy of history. And, most of my books have focused on people like John McCloy and Mac Bundy, paragons of the sort of Washington foreign policy establishment. And then after finishing Carter, I suddenly realized that, in retrospect, that establishment of McCloys and Bundys and even Oppenheimer, it's kind of disappeared. It's gone. And in its place, we have a culture and political culture that is really haunted by Roy Cohn and his politics and his behavior as a lawyer, his legal ethics, his sensibilities, his ruthlessness. And so he now appears to me to be a far more important character in American history in the 20th century than I thought so when I started out writing about John McCloy, for instance.
Yeah, in many ways, we're living through Roy Cohn's playbook.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, when I don't want to put pressure on you, I know deadlines are a tough thing, but when can we expect the book?
Biographies take a long time.
It's take a life of its own, right? Whenever it's done, it's done. Well, I'm sure that'll make for a blockbuster film as well. Kai Bird, thank you for joining us today. Congratulations on the renewed interest in your fantastic book. Wish Marty were here to celebrate that with us today, but I'm glad that you are enjoying it right now.
Well, thank you, John, for having me. This has been a great conversation.
A pleasure. Always great to have you with the Wilson Center. Thanks to Kai Bird. If you haven't read the book or seen the movie, we recommend both. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thank you for your time and interest.